and it's estimated that the current replacement value for existing bulk infrastructure in South Africa is currently at just under 140 billion rand, according to the Water Research Commission. The Commission also highlights that the country needs investments of around 1.4 billion rand annually to maintain its current bulk water infrastructure. Now, while bulk water infrastructure tends to attract private sector financing, the municipal water services in the country are having no luck in that regard. We've got Dr Valerie Naidoo, who's the Executive Manager for Business and Innovation at the Commission, who joins us this evening for more. A very good evening to you, Doc, and thank you for joining us this evening. I found it quite interesting that a lot of these municipalities or the water sector within them usually would rely on private sector investment, and it looks like that's not happening as much as it should at the moment. How bad is the situation?
I think that firstly we should be attracting more investment, and I think investment is out there. I think the bigger issues are around how we structure some of the finance, how we share the risk between public and private sector. I think the other thing is around municipalities, the issues of governance and reliability of payments. How do we do that better? How are we able to train municipal officials that when we do structure the finance, that is managed effectively? And I think that goes down to how do we do performance-based contracts through PPPs, etc. But I think another aspect that sometimes comes with investment from the private sector, from development banks, etc., is the conditions that come with it. And sometimes we find that municipalities are not willing to take on some of those conditions. They go counter to some of the policy, some of the things that government wants, which is maybe more local employment linked to that, and that sort of increases risk in those areas. It doesn't mean that there aren't success stories in the country, but we definitely need more of them if we are to meet the gap and also meet the sustainable development goals.
What are some of those success stories, if you will, Doc, and the innovative mechanisms that would need to be implemented across different municipalities to make sure that there are more success stories when it comes to the replacement and maintenance of infrastructure? Because it should not be that in 2023 you had a cholera outbreak because of the lack of maintenance.
So I think, let me deal with maintenance a little bit separately from, say, capital infrastructure. I think where you have deals, public-private deals, where you can collect revenue and pay back on an investment, I think those are working. So you think about the Mondi and Durban recycling plants. I think Mbombela has got a good setup as well in terms of public-private. I think what we find with municipalities, though, and that is why, for example, the Development Bank of South Africa has created a water partnerships office, is how do we work with municipalities to enable them to structure the finance? And by doing that, we then are able to pay back. We are able to create reliability for some of the projects. Around operations and maintenance, the biggest issue is around how we collect our revenue, how we tariff and we collect our revenue. And what we're finding now is that it is very difficult. Water and sanitation budgets are not ring-fenced, so they belong to the municipality. So you find that we're unable to then structure that reliability of payback around some of that financing. I think if we can find a smart way, maybe not ring-fencing all of the budget, but some of the budget, then we're able to say this is how much we can now work with the private sector to pay back and kind of find the right kind of mechanism to do that.
And Doc, how much, if you could give us a sense, do these issues that you've just highlighted contribute to a severe backlog in service delivery in general?
I think in general it is having a major impact, in the sense that not only you also need the skills to be able to structure the finance and then manage those large contracts so that we're able to get our infrastructure up and running. The gaps in terms of the planning, and then from the planning to the execution is large. And so we have huge delays in large infrastructure, but we also got huge delays in sometimes the smaller technological interventions that are required for levels of service to meet certain community demands.
Yeah, and I suppose here one would wonder if there is a political will for government to work more closely with private and related stakeholders, not only for the skill set on the investment opportunities, but for that funding that you've just described to us. Do you think that there's enough of a willingness to bring the two parties together to create some form of solution?
I think when we look across the different municipalities, it really, again, this is why I spoke about governance, and to some extent that governance is linked to leadership. If you've got good leadership, they understand how complex and risky these large projects are, then we start seeing them move in the right direction. So some of the large metros, we see that kind of direction being taken. But in some of the smaller metros where, and I think very often we've reported this, where sometimes you don't even have enough engineers in those metros, then it is difficult to structure these large water and sanitation centralized works and then be able to implement it on the ground and then operate and maintain it through, maybe again, if you don't have the skills, how do you then operate it through contracts, through maybe private sector coming in to help you with some of that skill sets that you have as a deficit. And I think we're constantly having these discussions around how do we be more inclusive and include more people into the economy, but at the same time, how do we also bring private sector which have the skills? And I think that is a very complicated space in the sense that in our procurement processes, it is so risk averse that you cannot always build developmental pathways where you bring local communities or SMMEs into that space. And so we find that we're always at loggerheads between the political space, which wants to create more jobs, and then maybe the space where we're trying to create more sustainable jobs. And I think there's a difference there. And in South Africa, we need to have some honest discussions in terms of how we create more sustainable jobs rather than short-term jobs just linked to a project.
Yeah.
And I think that's where we're stuck in the water and sanitation sector as well.
Yeah, Doc, I'm glad you raised that, and I'm wondering if it links into my final question around the Commission flagging that there's been too much of a focus on new water infrastructure projects and really creating a misalignment between maintenance and new projects. Does that link into your answer that you just gave us there in terms of sustainable jobs, which would, I suppose, work wonderfully in maintenance projects in municipalities?
So what we're finding is that, firstly, if you want to be more inclusive in the economy and include sort of SMMEs, you almost need to aggregate services and find a sort of a middleman, a PSP that manages these small companies as they develop. Because you want to get reliable services, right? You want to be able to have quality services, but you also want to develop them so that they, again, are able to build sustainable businesses. If we're unable to put those mechanisms in place, firstly, we are unable to become inclusive of the broader sector of the South African population. I think that's the first thing. I think secondly, if you're unable to aggregate some of these procurements processes and manage it in a very effective way, you're unable to then bring online these smaller companies, these innovators that may have solutions for some of the communities, and be able to distribute some of this, the sort of economy that is linked to service-related jobs within the water and sanitation sector. So I think we need to think more innovatively around how we firstly invest in developing some of these companies, and then how we invest in creating demand through the procurement system so that these smaller companies can create jobs and create more sustainable jobs. Right now, most of them end up starting and then basically they fail because they have low cash flows. They're unable to deal with the very complex, municipal procurement systems, etc. And so we lose a lot of the opportunities that we can create where the state becomes a major employer, but in a more sustainable way through aggregation services, through maybe creating more developmental pathways for these smaller companies, for consultants to be involved in the water and sanitation space, but at local level, rather than just only dealing with some of the large water and sanitation companies or corporates that operate not only in South Africa but globally.
Thank you very much for those insights, Dr. Valerie Naidoo from the Water Research Commission, joining us to speak around the costs of water infrastructure and what needs to be done in the country, not only to create sustainable jobs, but to ensure infrastructure that provides service delivery.